the Northern Territory has become just a bit unsafe. Indeed, it's become so unsafe that Alice Springs was ranked as the 18th most unsafe city in the world, according to one recent ranking measure. Now, we can debate about whether Alice Springs is really that unsafe, and about whether it's really more unsafe than Tijuana in Mexico, but the outlook doesn't look good. And Alice Springs certainly is bad, and crime certainly is out of control, whether we're looking at rankings like that, or whether we're looking at rankings that are coming out from the Northern Territory Police, where they're reporting on crime statistics. For example, if we're looking at rates of offending per 100,000 population, according to the Northern Territory Police Fire and Emergency Services, well, assaults per 100,000 are 9,233.9 in the 2022-2023 year. That's rather a lot of assaults. Compare that to Darwin. In Darwin, it's down at 2,800. That is still more than it should be. It should be 0, but certainly less bad than Alice Springs. If you look at house break-ins, well, that's large as well. 3,870 in Alice Springs. By contrast, there's 966 in Darwin. If you look at motor vehicle theft, well, in Darwin, that's 901. In Alice Springs, that's 1,624. Property damage in Alice Springs, that's 11,908. In Darwin, that's 2,837. You get the picture. Alice Springs is a lot more unsafe than Darwin. Now, both of these are in the Northern Territory, but clearly the situation is much worse in one location versus the other. And one hates to think how much worse Alice Springs is compared to other capital cities such as Sydney or Adelaide or Canberra. Now, the situation has gotten so bad that it was instrumental in the ALP losing in the latest territory elections, and the Country Liberal Party taking victory in a landslide. Indeed, the ALP performed so badly, they were reduced to a small minority of only 5 seats in the Legislative Assembly. They were wiped out. People clearly were sick of the crime. They were sick of the carjackings, the burglaries, and the thefts, and they wanted someone to at least try to do something about it. And the CLP, in turn, has moved to try to reduce crime, especially youth crime. Their first main initiative is to try to reduce the age of criminal responsibility back to 10 from 12. In fact, as recently as 2022, until the ALP raised the age of criminal responsibility, it was in fact 10. That is, if someone is over the age of 10, then they could potentially be prosecuted for criminal wrongdoing. This is interesting because as recently as 2022, that was actually the case. But in 2022, the ALP actually raised the age of criminal responsibility to 12. That is what the CLP is doing here, is trying to put the law back where it was as recently as, in fact, 2022. This is not a major change, it is not a major alteration, and in fact it brings the Northern Territory in alignment with New South Wales. And there are some nuances as well in relation to this. So it's not as if every wrongdoer who is aged over 10 would necessarily go to prison. Rather, there is nuance. And the way this typically works is that if the offender is below the age of responsibility, they cannot be criminally punished. So for example, in the Northern Territory right now, that's 12, but the CLP wants to bring that back down to 10. However, if they're between the age of criminal responsibility and 14, then there is a rebuttable presumption that they did not understand what they were doing and what they were doing was wrong. This, of course, can be rebutted with evidence that they were so aware. That is, there is a rebuttable presumption that they cannot be criminally responsible. The strength and nature of that presumption varies between jurisdiction. So, to put this in perspective, under current legislation in the Northern Territory, if someone is under 12, they cannot be prosecuted. But if they're between the age of 12 and 14, there is a rebuttable presumption that they did not know what they were doing is wrong. And that can be rebutted with evidence that they did in fact know what they were doing was wrong. The CLP wishes to lower that 12-year threshold back down to 10 years, putting it back where it was in 2022. Now, this is not actually that different from other states. For example, in New South Wales, the age of criminal responsibility is 10, but if they're under the age of 14, then there is a general law presumption that they are not responsible unless they are proven to know what they were doing was wrong. The CLP, therefore, would be bringing the Northern Territory situation into alignment with that of New South Wales, for example. Now, the policy approach behind this is easy to see. There are concerns about crime in places particularly like Alice Springs, and in particular youth crime. And there's a couple of concerns in relation to youth crime. Firstly, that young people know they can get away with wrongdoing, therefore they engage in it, because they simply know they cannot be prosecuted. It's much like if you stop prosecuting people for shoplifting, people will shoplift more, like California in the United States has found out. So the goal, therefore, is a bit of a deterrent. Furthermore, there's a concern that current punishments are a little bit too lax on young offenders. Therefore, by having the possibility of jail time or other remedial measures, it might enable greater interventions. For example, if at the moment, young offenders can only go back to a guardian, and then one relies on the guardian to educate the person to not engage in wrongdoing, but the guardian is dropping the ball, then that type of remediation simply fails. The goal, therefore, is to try to improve diversionary attributes and try to redirect youth offenders if the at-home situation is not stopping them from otherwise offending. And that could be for various reasons that are perhaps a topic for another time. But in any case, if there's a concern that youth offenders are simply getting away with more and more offending, and they know they can get away with it, so they engage in it, and also they're not being educated to not engage in it, then one needs to take remedial actions, such as lowering the age of criminal responsibility. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all young offenders would go straight to prison. What it would mean is one could take additional actions, potentially educational-related actions or community service, to try to direct that person away from engaging in more crime. The scare headlines that now young offenders are just going to end up in jail aren't necessarily true, because jail is only one type of punishment one can impose upon individuals. And I dare say that for young offenders, jail would be a last resort punishment that would only come in if they are repeat offenders and are clearly not learning their lesson. Now, of course, this notwithstanding, there have been concerns that this is in fact racism. They appear to be assuming that the law would catch up people of a particular race more than other people. They do not say exactly which race they believe is committing more crimes. However, they seem to assume that one race was committing more crimes, hence their cries that it was engaging in racism. However, to my mind, if all people are subject to the same law, that law is not being applied in a discriminatory manner, and the law itself is of general applicability and is not per se discriminatory in and of itself, then clearly it is not racist. This isn't a situation where we are applying a law that has a disproportionate effect on different people, or a law that perhaps is applied differently to different people, or a law that is perhaps only applied to different individuals or targets particular individuals. Rather, it is a law of general applicability. Anyone above a particular age could be criminally responsible, and those below that age would not be criminally responsible, regardless of racial background. But of course, that doesn't stop people asserting that this law is somehow racist. Now, to my mind, I'm not necessarily convinced that lowering the age of criminal responsibility should be ideal. That is, ideally, we should be trying to remediate people, rehabilitate people, so they're not engaging in crimes. I'm not particularly fond of sending more people to prison. Rather, I'm more fond of rehabilitation if and when that is possible. However, that type of rehabilitation approach takes years. It's not an instant fix. One needs to bring that into the system to try to lower crime rates gradually over time. It's a great solution if you don't have a crisis right now. It's a great solution for long-term rehabilitation and enabling people to re-enter into society. The problem that Alice Springs finds itself in at the moment is there is a current crime crisis. And saying that you're going to rehabilitate people for 5 years down the track doesn't solve the carjackings right now. It doesn't solve the burglaries right now. It doesn't solve the crime situation right now that is making people unsafe. And the victims of those crimes are really more deserving of our sympathy than the wrongdoers of those crimes, to my mind. Therefore, it is important to take a measure at the moment that at least reduces crimes, and at least does something to try to tackle the situation. Now, I do very much hope that when they are engaging in these types of measures, when they're punishing young offenders, they punish them in a manner that doesn't just put them into a cycle of going back and forth to jail, because that both A, is not good for the person, and also B, is massively costly for the state and therefore for taxpayers. I hope, therefore, that when these young offenders are perhaps punished for engaging in wrongdoing, there's diversionary measures and rehabilitation to try to stop them engaging in more crime in the future so they can become productive members of society and therefore ultimately cost us less money, because if someone is just going back and forth to jail and is not holding down a steady job, they end up being incredibly costly to the taxpayer, and therefore it's beneficial to ensure that people can become productive members of society, and there isn't just a cycle of incarceration. So this is overall not an easy situation to resolve. I give the CLP credit for trying to resolve it, and I hope that they operationalize these changes in a productive way. But let me know your thoughts about the CLP's measures and whether you think they are right or whether you think they are wrong and what they should be doing about youth crime. I'd be interested to hear what you think about the whole situation.